Welcome to Catholic Truth Online. We are going through a series on the Green Catechism, and it is a Catechism of Catholic Doctrine. We are now on to Chapter 5, which is our first parents and original sin. So we're going to go through this, and I will explain briefly as we go through the chapter. First question: who were the first man and woman? The first man and woman were Adam and Eve, the first parents of the whole human race. So that's basically the account of Genesis, where God, after creating certain things, produces man, and later on he then produces woman also, so that we have the first man and woman who are, it seems from the text of the Bible that they were, and it's clear in fact that they were already full-grown adults, and those were the first human beings, the original father and mother of the human race. What special gifts did God give our first parents? God gave our first parents sanctifying grace, full control of their passions, and freedom from suffering and death. Okay, let's break that down. So they had sanctifying grace was the first point, and that is that by which we share God's life. It's not yet the beatific life, it's not yet the consummation of this beginning of eternal life within us, but that's what it is. It's the beginning of eternal life in the soul. God begins to live in the soul in such a way that it's a real communicative, unitive kind of life, and we are expected to increase that when we reach the age of reason. We are expected to cooperate with it, cause it to grow as much as possible by making use of actual graces. But grace is something we'll come on to later. But basically, sanctifying grace is our sharing in God's life. It's the gift that God gave us. It is it's like bridging the great gap between God and man, such that it's the link whereby we attain the supernatural life, because God is infinite and we are finite, so there has to be some means of linking those two extremes, and that is sanctifying grace. Then it says that there was full control of the passions also. So the passions are tendencies in human nature towards good and away from evil. There are 11 passions. They're all paired off with an opposite, except for the last one, which is anger. So they are. You have the concupiscible appetite, and you have the irascible appetite, and under each of these headings you have a certain number of passions. Anger doesn't actually come under any particular one of those. It's it kind of has a good and evil sort of as its object, so it's sort of it's an interesting one. There's a certain zeal which justifies anger, so you can't. In fact, all the passions are good in themselves. And so under the concupiscible we have joy, sadness, love, hatred, desire, and aversion. Then under the irascible we have fear, hope, courage, and despair. So that's a bit about the passions, but we might be able to treat of them a bit later on, or in some other video hopefully, but we need to move on. So then they also had freedom from suffering and death, which meant that they're not only were they immortal spiritually, but they were also, even the bodies of the first man and woman were to begin with immortal, although they lost that after the fall. Did God, and besides, obviously there were the preternatural gifts, presumably, which not a whole lot has been taught about, but there's a certain excellence that went with being in the state of original justice, which we don't have now. Did God intend the special gifts of Adam and Eve for their descendants also? Yes, God would have given these gifts to the descendants of our first parents if Adam, the head of the human race, had obeyed his command. So what they're saying is that it's set up in such a way that we would have shared in the innocence of Adam, just as we would have shared in his innocence, all of us, so we have all shared in his guilt. And it's basically asking, would we have had the same privileges and gifts? And the answer is yes, we would have. I mean, there's no reason why we wouldn't. We only wouldn't if they didn't cooperate with grace, which unfortunately is what happened. What special command did God give Adam and Eve? God commanded Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit of a certain tree in the Garden of Paradise. So that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that was there in the garden. It was like a tangible mark or statement of loyalty of God to man. It was a real tangible physical test. I mean, since Adam and Eve were not just angels, weren't purely spirits, they also lived in a physical world and were subject to or united with physical bodies. And it's perhaps fitting that there was an actual physical testament to God's test, which was this tree and the fruit on it, which they were to leave alone, basically. Did Adam and Eve obey the command of God? Adam and Eve did not obey the command of God. They were tempted by the devil and ate the forbidden fruit. So the devil was allowed to tempt Eve in the form of a serpent, which we read about in Genesis. And instead of turning away, she had quite a big long conversation with the devil. And one-on-one, they say the devil has got you. So she argued with the devil until she eventually gave in to his subtlety of speech and ate the apple, and then she proceeded to offer it to Adam, who, wanting to please his wife, also ate the apple, and thus we have the fall. How were our first parents punished by God for their sin? Now, the sin was in fact an act of disobedience, and it was a serious act of disobedience, and basically it was the deception of the devil was that don't be silly, God knows that if you eat this fruit, you will have the knowledge of good and evil. You will be as gods then. Your eyes will be opened. Right now you don't know evil. And so they thought, well, we're going to be greater than we are already. And that was the temptation of pride coming in. Let's be greater than we already are. But it's always an illusion and a lie, really, because it's disordered. Love of self is not ordered correctly. And therefore, following that train of thought, they allowed themselves to carry on in that train of thought, and it led them to commit the sin against God's command. So how were they punished for their sin? Our first parents lost sanctifying grace and their other special gifts and were driven out of the Garden of Paradise. So it says that they lost sanctifying grace and their other special gifts and were driven out of the Garden of Paradise. So now they're subject to suffering and death. Also, the passions are no longer under their control entirely. They kind of do their own thing and they tend towards evil, and that's what we inherit as well, as the sons and as the children of Adam and Eve. Have we, the children of Adam and Eve, suffered because of his sin? Because of Adam's sin, we are born without sanctifying grace. Our intellect is darkened, our will is weakened, our passions incline us to evil, and we are subject to suffering and death. That's a punishment, and no one gets out of it. Everybody is born like that. We have a certain selfishness, we have rebellion within ourselves against the correct ordering of things, and that's a huge problem. We're born without sanctifying grace, and the Church baptizes us as soon as possible when we are infants. That didn't used to be the case, by the way, but now for some time it has been the case, infant baptism, so that we can get a bit of well, not exactly a head start. Well, I suppose it is. I mean, compared to how it used to be, we have a bit of a head start, and we have the grace of God in us until the age of reason, when we're supposed to then make use of actual graces and keep progressing onwards. So we've suffered all of that. Now there's the three principal wounds. The wound of the mind, or the intellect, is called the wound of ignorance, or vulnera ignorentiae in Latin, and then there's the wound in the will, or the heart if you like. I mean, the correct word is really the will, not the heart. That's kind of a, seems like a bit of an emotional, less theological word. But the will, the wound of the will is the wound of malice, vulnera malitiae, and then you have the wound in the flesh, which is kind of also, you could say, it's how the lower passions rebel against the higher faculties or the higher man, and that is vulnera concupiscentiae, the wound of concupiscence. How do we call the state in which we are born because of the sin of Adam? The state in which we are born because of the sin of Adam is called the state of original sin, and that's quite straightforward. We've basically gone through that. That is called original sin, and that's where it comes from. That's what it is. Why is original sin so called? Original sin is so called because it comes down to us through our origin, our descent from Adam, the head of the human race. We have just talked about that, so we will move on. Was any human person ever preserved from original sin? The Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, was preserved free from original sin, and this privilege is called her Immaculate Conception. So there we are, that's that chapter. And that last point there was about, yes, there is one human being, well, aside from Christ, who was entirely preserved from the very beginning, from conception, from all stain of original sin. So that is the Immaculate Conception in view of her being called to be the Mother of God. And as Catholics we know that it didn't used to be, before it was defined, it was up for debate. Some people thought, well, maybe she was sanctified in the womb, a bit like John the Baptist and Jeremiah, but no, she was actually the only one that the Church teaches was conceived without original sin from conception. So that concludes that, and I hope you'll keep following me in these videos, and as we go through the rest of this catechism, and the next one will be on actual sin, and I hope you will join me for that next video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.